access to books and everything. We fight for the education of the children on the whole, therefore go with the side of the government.
Thank the Prime Minister for the speech. We open the debate on the side of opposition by the leader of opposition. Here.
Wait. You see me? It's not up yet. No, is it blocking you, that thing?
Oh, it doesn't.
Alright, sure. We think side government severely missed the debate in today's debate. We think that the debate just doesn't revolve around primary education or secondary education. We think that tertiary education is an important aspect of education itself, that is the completion of all these three organs, or all these three elements, that allows you to get jobs, that allows you to be a functioning member of society. We think that only when you focus on these two elements of education, you cripple the effect of the nation. You don't become a developing nation, you become an underdeveloped nation. I have a few rebuttals in this debate. Firstly, my only rebuttal on 5-level responses, because she told you that you will have better access, and then you solve the problem in this situation, and that's pretty much all she said, right? Because you have access to rural areas, and she explained how we necessarily were to begin with. We think first level response. We think that current status quo within this situation has significantly improved from 20 years ago. Nations that are developing 20 years ago, sure, they had some form of rural issues with education. But for example, in Malaysia, the worst case scenario is that you have to pay 1 ringgit to go on a bus for a 5 km trip to the school. Not like a long time ago where you have 20-kilometer journeys to get to your school. We think the situation is significantly improved. They have over-exaggerated the problem to begin with. The second response is that she told you that individuals always have to work extremely hard to obtain money to go to education to begin with, and that's why you need to provide more access to do so. We don't see, firstly, however, it solves individuals who have poverty. You just have more access, you don't give them money. But secondly, education is free in developing nations. In a large majority of nations, India, Malaysia, we think in situations like this, education is free to begin with, not a real problem. But the third response is that she told you that this is a 50% removal of the tertiary education system. Generally, is it really necessarily enough? Because she characterized to you the situation that a lot of places require schools, and a lot of places are in situations where they are without a proper form of education. Isn't necessarily enough. When she told you they don't even have chairs, they don't have blackboards, they don't have proper teachers to begin with. We don't think it's enough to begin with. The fourth response is that you create a blank society that is only focused on the first and second form of education. You will never ever move forward. That means, sure, you have the whole nation in its first and second education, but not one bright spark will come up and say, I have a degree in medicine, or I have a degree in engineering. That means the focus will always be forever on first and second education. We think that's necessarily harmful to begin with. We think first fifth response, is it necessarily an important investment, or is it a good investment to begin with? Because, for example, you can look at nations like India or in nations like Malaysia. We think that in these kinds of nations, individuals who are from the urban areas became leaders through tertiary education, and then at the end of the day, they helped the rural areas develop, right? For example, in Malaysia, to Dr. Mahathir, right? He helped our nation come up after he got the degree from that tertiary education, and therefore improved that education within rural areas. We think that situation is significantly improved from Malaysian independence to begin with. What really happens, and let me characterize what this debate really is about, because what is the state of a developing nation to begin with? You need to make an investment in order to improve the situation. But the question that becomes, is that investment a legit and important investment that you can see a foreseeable benefit to begin with? We argue no. We're going to talk about two things. Right? We think that also developing nations have to talk about individuals who are rich and individuals who are poor. There'll be a top placenta and the bottom half of the social standard. What happens in this situation? Right? Two things. Number one, the universities or tertiary education, sure, it doesn't go down, sure, it doesn't disappear or obliterate, but we think at the end of the day, the quality will severely deteriorate, and that's something you have to accept in order for this debate to move on. But secondly, to a certain extent, in extreme cases, it's very possible for universities to shut down because they only have their money focused, and they are very small universities, right? You have UMP and so on and so forth. What are we going to prove to you in today's debate? Number one, we're going to prove to you why tertiary education funding is more of a less risky investment, especially when it comes to developing nations when investments are the priority. Number two, we're going to talk about how maintenance of the tertiary education is important for the value of education as a whole. And number three, why a severe reduction in the quality of tertiary education would harm a child, especially individuals who are working for their parents when education no longer becomes a priority within situations. We think it severely harms to this. But the question that becomes, how do we then improve the education system? Do you cut one and improve one and just maintain like that for another 100 years? Or do you wait and invest in the situation to improve? Because as we've seen in the past 50 years, nations, the developing nations, have improved the rural education system that exists within the countries. There are more schools, and you have to admit that. There are more schools within rural areas of the nation. We think that's an investment to begin with. First level of argumentation. education requires a particular form of completion. First level of analysis, what is the principle of education? 2. Number 1, it is an education that has completion and therefore you can get a job. Number 2, it is continuous consistency until the very end, until you can become a functioning member within the members of society. These 2 principles have to be upheld within the education sphere for it to be an applicable or an education that has some form of standard within international recognition. Second level of analysis, will a reduction in quality of tertiary education improve the overall education? We say no, with 2 reasons, right? Because you don't complete. How is it so? The education is built within 3 things, right? First, second, third. And the first one is the introduction towards education. Second one is consistent build up towards the end. And the third one is the clincher, where you can get a degree and you can get a job and then contribute back to society. When you remove that third one, you remove the consistency that has been working for the past two education terms, and at the end of the day, you remove the ability for them to actually gain any benefit at all because they aren't allowed to apply the benefits that they learned from the first education and the second education in their third education system, because that is when they need to get their degree to begin with. The third level of analysis is this: that what is the situation of the economy? That somewhat the situation of these unhygienic current primary and secondary schools. We don't think it's as bad as they exaggerated, right? Because to a certain extent it is safe. Sure, somewhat is unsanitary. Sure, some chairs will be a less amount. But at the end of the day, you get some basic form of education that isn't as bad as you portray. To a certain extent, it's not perfect. But at the end of the day, it's an investment that requires time and requires patience in order for you to do so. We've seen in the past where it's been worse, right? And when we were patient and we waited for time, at the end of the day, you get what you want. The second level of argumentation is that people will never want to go to school to begin with. What is the nature of individuals who live within this rural space if they really want to talk about it to do so? Firstly, they have extremely conservative parents and they are below the poverty line. That means priority is work, work, work. You know, you sell food on the roadside, you go and work in the oil palm trees, and so on and so forth. But secondly, they are constantly torn apart between their work and their education to begin with. And they fight extremely hard to get education within rural areas like this. We can see it in India. What happens in this situation, right? Two things, right? Number one, there's a deterrent for you to actually attend school, because now that you know that the completion of education no longer exists, why would you want to attend an education system that is not complete and not perfect? We think at the end of the day, although to a certain extent it is imperfect, at the end of the day, it's some form of completion that exists within the situation to do so. But the second harm is that the price increase in degrees, because at the end of the day, you remove funding with these universities, the price of a degree to get a degree instantly goes up because there is less of a supply than there is of a demand. That's the economic system, right? Therefore, you deter individuals to actually want to go to school to begin with, because firstly, they think there's a flawed education, that you don't have the proper way to get your tertiary degree. But secondly, it's a flawed economy, that you have to pay more to get something that is of less quality because there is less of a supply of it at the end of the day. This is harmful because only rich individuals will only be go to universities. At the end of the day, there will be a huge stigma that only rich are the ones that deserve to get go to university. At the end of the day, this is a harm that you aren't responsible for, a harm to the birth lottery. Just because you're poor, it doesn't mean you don't deserve some form of basic education at the end. We don't think this is fair. Please side opposition.
Thank the leader of opposition for his speech. Now let's invite the next 5 minutes further case to settle. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, by diverting tertiary education funding to improving primary and secondary education, we think that it will help poor schools in rural areas to improve their services in terms of facilities, infrastructure, workforce, and stuff, right? Because we think that these are vital towards the development of the children at the school. So we want to improve the quality of our education, and it's not enough. And the current quality of education that we have currently is not enough to cater towards a better society, right? So we believe in today's debate that we should focus on equality and basic access to basic education. So my Prime Minister has to talk to you how that tertiary education will still remain, and even though from the half from this funding that has been cut to half now, it will still remain and won't shut down. We have told you the means that how it's going to still stand up from these corporations that will keep on donating on consistent terms to these tertiary institutions, right? So we have plenty of sponsorships, like from Toyota, Samsung, Hewlett Packard, and this will improve and will help this tertiary education to keep on moving on the right path. But what we are worried about is that the accessibility to the children, to the students in the rural areas who are not from the concentrated area where the quality of education are better, right? So we think that from this limited funding, it can be utilized to its full potential, because when we have something in excess, we tend to take it for granted. Now that it's limited, we think that we will fully utilize this to its maximum potential. Yes, sir.
A huge majority of the sponsors you talk about only apply to private universities, where the state has no control over allocating funds. Within state universities, who really sponsors you at the end of the day?
Even so, when the funding, even if they are to say that the price of the fees, the institution fee will hike, we think that it's not going to be that significant, because in the first place, we will have more and more people who will be more interested to donate or to help to aid these institutions to keep on working on. Okay, so let me move on to the rebuttals, right? So you talk about the stigma, about how the stigma will keep on being there because of the not only rich children will have access to the tertiary education. We think that this is wrong, because firstly, the problem now is that the poor people, the poor students, don't have access to this basic education, because when we talk about primary and secondary education, we are talking about basic skills like counting, reading, and writing, and these students have been living in poverty for a long time, so they don't know what's reading, so they don't even know their rights because they don't have access to such things. Like in India, for example, right? You have kids in the slums and stuff like that. So we think that this is wrong, and this is going to be dangerous for this future of the children, right? And for the secondary, why we see it's important, because it helps these children to later, after they have learned how to count and read and write, they will know and further identify themselves as to interests, and they get to identify themselves like what they like a sport, and maybe they like debating. That's when they find their self-identification there. We think that this is important. So this is vital for them to identify what path they want to choose, because not necessarily everyone who graduates from secondary schools will go to tertiary education, because they believe that maybe working will bring them more benefits compared to going to tertiary education. Even so, we don't blame people if they want. We won't like stop and restrict people from going advancing to pursue tertiary education, right? And also they talk about it's a less risky investment to keep on going with to stay with the current status quo. But we think that it's just going to make it more risky. We think that we have already cushioned our policy with the corporate responsibilities and stuff, and it won't be hard to maintain the education. And we're not talking about removing the third tertiary education fully. So now let's move on my points, right? So I'm going to tell you how it's going to back up the state interest, and secondly on the community interest. Like, so how exactly that? Okay, on my first statistics on the level of state. So how does it better serve in the interest of the state, right? We think that what the state really needs is the resources and skills, and currently that's what lacking. In India, for example, that they have like billions of people there, but the potential is not fully discovered, it's not fully explored. That's why we think by introducing and solidifying the primary and secondary education, this will help them to better actualize themselves as a state and as a country, as a renowned country, right? So we think that if we are to further solidify this access to education, the literacy rate can be increased, and this will lead to better skills. And from these better skills, it will open up opportunities to these people, because now they have access and they know where to go afterwards, because now they know how to read, they know where to find all these informations, right? So from all these opportunities that have been presented in front of them, it will help them to know where exactly to go. And when these individuals already know what they want to do with their life, they will do something about it. And how is it going to help the state? It is going to boost the economy of the state. How? Because the initiative by individuals wanting to get themselves out of the poverty, it will help them to want to work hard and improve the economy and life situation of their family, right? And the gap between developed and developing countries will be reduced because the basic skills in poor nations now has been mastered and then has been instilled in the children. So we think that this is going to help state interest in the long run. And secondly, the community, we think that the standard of living of the family will be improved. Be it in the social condition and economy, because now the drive and passion to further pursue their life in a better path has been triggered, and they will want to keep changing. They will want to change the situation of their family currently in. So we want them to get out of this, because if we are to stick with the current status quo, not everyone will have access. Now, the ones who are because in this capitalistic system, right, the ones who are behind and who are not born in a very fortunate families will be left behind. So we want to equalize this and provide them with equal standing so that everyone can at least know the basic stuff that they should know before they went out to the real world. So we think that in order to improve this life, we should focus on the quality and access to basic education first before we can further think of how to improve the situation in the future for these people. And with that, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank the private speech. Now advise that the leader of position further the case side of.
Yeah.
If at the end of the education you don't receive a job, we don't think the people in poverty, people who see that what my next meal will be, what can best rake in money, would be incentivized to ever to go to school. And we think that's what the government has totally missed in today's debate, that these individuals will never see going to school as something which can bring benefits to their family, which can change the situation that they're in, as long as they cannot go to tertiary education, which can change their life at the end of the day when we remove like substantial amount of funding towards this tertiary education. Few levels of rebuttals towards the case. So let's see what the DPM told you, right? She said it helps these students determine what career path they want to go to because they can learn a few skills. But this is the problem, right? Let's characterize the status quo of these primary and secondary schools. They have a strict form of syllabus. It applies across all borders. So you don't actually get to pick and choose subjects that you want to learn. You can only do that in tertiary education. You can only study what you like in tertiary education. That's the difference here. But secondly, we think that you can only learn what niche areas and what skills you want to do as a doctor, as an architect, only in tertiary education. You don't get to determine, like science, sure, science is the basis of all those things, or art is the basis of all those things, but those things are the determinants of how well you perform your job at the end of the day. The determinants of how well you study in the tertiary education, that's much more important. But secondly, she told you how you reduce the the disparity between the rich and poor countries. No link whatsoever to that point. But even if there was a link, we think this only applies if the tertiary education is as such rate internationally recognized. Why is this so? You can see that in the academia like Harvard and Oxford. We think these are institutions that are internationally recognized. It actually reduces the disparity between the rich and poor country. If that poor country has such an institution, we don't think that primary schools and secondary schools are valued at that rate. And in status quo, we don't think the argument stands. So she told you lastly, like this idea that you improve the standard of living of these families. But I've already told you, right, that these individuals, these students, they want to see what can best bring in money for the family at the end of the day. If they see the end of the road of education, there's no job for them, there's no prospects for them to ever earning money, they'd rather work at the farm where they can actually earn the next meal for their family. That's the argument that Roshan brought up today, never responded by your case. No, I'll tackle now on your PM's case, right? She told you that 50% of the funding will remove and the MNCs can still fund this tertiary education. Especially problematic here, because you have to understand that only private tertiary education gets sponsors in this situation, not the national, like UT Mara does not get any sponsors, KDU gets sponsors, Taylor's get sponsors. There's a difference here, because UT Mara is funded by the state itself, and the state isn't profit oriented. You see that this private tertiary education, these MNCs look at them as an investment, and that's why they sponsor them, because they can see that they can get prospects out at the end of the day, they can tie them to certain jobs, not the state in this situation. That's why state actually gives out what do you call that? It gives us scholarships, right? Because it recognizes that you as an individual has a capability to study, and we don't tie you down to certain jobs at the end of the day. As long as we give you scholarship, if you do well in school, it's especially important. But it's also a concession when she said that MNCs fund tertiary education. Because by natural logic, if MNCs don't fund primary schools and secondary schools, but they fund tertiary education, even if it's local tertiary education, it proves that the MNCs recognize the value of the tertiary education compared to the primary school and secondary schools, which is so much more important in today's debate. But lastly, this idea where early development is important for children, you need to learn basics and stuff, but you have to understand that at the end of the day, you have to place it on a comparative. Sure, let's consider certain benefits. You have better quality of teachers in primary schools, secondary schools, you get we can improve funding of books and for curriculum, but you have to place it on a comparative compared to tertiary education, where this is the area where people get to learn what niche area they can go to, what degree they can get, what job prospects they get at the end of the day, how best they can contribute back to the state, and how best they can remove this idea of poverty which they have been living in for I don't know how many years of their life. We have to place it on a comparative and have to value tertiary education at the end of the day, because this is what changes their life. No. And they never really intended to rebut Roshan's idea of how education requires completion, how people are disincentivized from ever attending school. No rebuttal whatsoever towards those 2 points. Before I move on to my case,
Look, people need certification from primary and secondary school to qualify for the tertiary education. This is really important.
Yeah, but I already told you the incentive for these students who are in poverty, like you characterize, to go to school is if they see at the completion they can actually get a job, they can actually earn money. Your side removes the idea of completion, because the idea is that I go to a very lousy university, at the end of the day, I won't get possible better job prospects to improve my chances of better standard of living at the end of the day. They have no incentive to go to school. That's when you can't get job prospects. No. Okay, let's go on to my case, right? 2 points for you. Number one, about the development of students, and number two, about international recognition of these universities and why it's so valuable towards these developing nations. So, we have to understand that in the formative years, it's just a mere exposure to all the subjects that you discover what field of interest you're in, not specifically on a general basis like science or arts and these kind of things, right? Because syllabus is all the same across the whole nation. So you have to understand in primary schools, the disparity between good teachers and bad teachers, which is what they would like to argue, is not that big because they're teaching the same syllabus. Compared to tertiary education, where under their side they'll have bad tertiary education educators, under our side we'll have good ones. The disparity is much more bigger because there's no direct and strict syllabus. The disparity is bigger because there's a wider range that good teachers can cover, and there's a smaller range that those bad lecturers can actually cover. No, so the difference in tertiary education is this, that students actually discover what they like and dislike and what they want to pursue as the job at this age, not at a young age. Like when I'm 6 years old or when I'm 12 years old, I don't know what I want to be yet. I probably want to be a pilot, but at the end of the day, after 16 more years, I gradually change my mind. And it's at this critical stage where just before you're getting a job, that's when you determine, what field of study you want to go to. But why is tertiary education much more different than secondary school? 3 things. Number one, there's a wider range of field of studies. Number two, it is more specific in nature. And number three, you have better teachers in terms of important stuff, right? Because we have to understand that most teachers who teach in primary and secondary schools are local teachers. So we have to understand that in law and architecture and medicine, these are more crucial years in the development of the student's life, right? Where they can study these niche subjects, they can actually contribute back to the state better. When you remove the funding, you decrease the standard of lecturers in this university, you decrease the range of these subjects provided to the students, and you decrease the availability of certain apparatus which is necessary in the completion of understanding certain concepts in the university, especially harmful. But a last point, international recognition, is especially important because you have to understand that students always want their work to be peer reviewed, to be accepted by the academia. When you remove the idea that these institutions should get funded, like the Municipal University in India, remove the idea that their medical research should be funded. The idea is this, that these papers that the students publish will never be peer reviewed, will never be accepted by academia. It's so harmful to their morale, it's so harmful to their future job prospects as well. Because in order to be accepted in the future, you have to have certain published papers or certain researchers which are accepted by the white populace. This in fact damages the developing nation as well, when they prove that it's a failure, that they cannot provide good young prospects in every field that the university provides in. It's especially harmful towards the developing nation, where investments at a peak in that situation, and now you cut it off, and that's when you destroy the potential for these individuals to contribute back to the state.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for the speech. like the government with some specific cases, the government union.
Mr. Speaker, I go with a really strong base rather than a shaky or a shaky one that doesn't even guarantee having a good one in the future, right? This is the principle that has been established by the government side in the first place. We are trying to develop these children from when they were young, from the basic of their education to be pushed forward until they reach the tertiary level, Mr. Speaker. This is what the main idea of the government, right? We are trying to improvise, to improve the facilities and of the education in the primary and secondary level in the first place, so that these children will be more developed and more understanding of the way of the education system works in the first place, right? So this one will push them forward so that they can enter the tertiary level or the university level to be more developed in the future, right? For their under their argument of saying there's incomplete of education, right? We're saying that it will be complete if we push them forward from the beginning, right? So this is what the main idea is. The main idea is if we give them a crappy education since they were young, right? They will not be motivated enough to study or to further study up till reaching the tertiary level, right? So this is why we are pushing them forward from when they were young, from where the basic is, so that they will not comply to go to the university level in the first place, and actually qualify to go to the university level in the first place, right? On their side, right, Mr. Speaker, what they're trying to say is that we're taking away the funding to the tertiary level as a whole. No, what my Prime Minister have said earlier, we are just taking the 50% out of the funding of this tertiary level to go to fund for the primary and secondary level to improve the facilities of this education in the first place, not neglecting at all for the tertiary level students, Mr. Speaker. If they get better, Mr. Speaker, it pushes forward what they won't stop, so they won't stop improving themselves and make them study more. We train them not to be foolish on how important education is to one, so that they are more aware of how important education is. When they say about what they're trying to imply here today, Mr. Speaker, is that we are trying to take away all the fund, whereas we are trying to take away a chunk of the fund to fund for the people in the first place from the very beginning, right? So we come to the problem, Mr. Speaker, where the problem is the facility of the school is very poor, where they did not provide fairness to access of education and different quality in education in the first place, right? So under our paradigm, Mr. Speaker, we're trying to fight for the equality of the education for the tertiary level, for the secondary level, and the primary level, so that it will be a fair game for all. So the system can be better by improving the system and divert the funds to help improve the primary and secondary level in the first place, right? So the solution to the problem today, Mr. Speaker, as has been discussed by my Prime Minister and my DPM, they give basic access to basic education, right? We would like to have a more literate farmer than an illiterate farmer, Mr. Speaker, because it gives more advantage for the literate farmer in the first place. That is what we have discussed by Fatana earlier, when we say that these people are given the basic education in the first place. Even if they decided not to go to the tertiary level, they at least they have the basic knowledge of knowing how to count, knowing how to read, and knowing how to write, Mr. Speaker. So that is the main idea, giving them a very strong basic and giving them the choice of continuing to the tertiary tertiary level or not. But if they do want, if they do want to continue up to the tertiary level, the fund is still there for the 50%, right? So the solution is to divert the fund by half and not entirely neglecting the tertiary level, and give them the opportunity to learn since they are young, and give them the best. Before that,
students under both sides can learn how to read and count and whatever you want, because syllabus are the same across the board at primary and secondary school. It's not the same tertiary education, and you harm the prospects there.
so this is what I was saying, Mr. Speaker. The facility of the school that is in the rural area has been really poor. The teachers that have been coming to the rural area school is really poor, Mr. Speaker. So by having this fund in the first place, right, we are trying to fund these teachers to actually go for the school in rural area, and to educate more of the children, so that these children be more educated in the first place, Mr. Speaker, not neglecting anyone in the country in the first place, whether they are in rural areas or urban areas in the first place. So this is what the main concept. So this is what we're trying to fight in the first place. That is the equality of education, right? So under our paradigm, the result of implying under our paradigm is the balanced and fair access to education, and the inequality of distribution of funding will be abolished, and the concentrated funding will be better, right? Because the concentrated funding would be utilized to make the facility better, and accompany with for the student in the first place. When I stood up earlier and told about the literate society can better participate in democratization of country, right? They did not engage with the argument at all. We say that participation. We say that these people will participate in election, and they will be able to understand the policies of the country better, right? Crucially important for a developing country like Thailand, where people do not understand what's happening and exacerbate the political situation. How does primary and secondary education solve this, right? We will be able to read, to be informed of the country's political advancement, rather than they do not have anything at all, and hoping for the tertiary level of education where they are not sure whether they are going or not in the first place, right? So if for us, we see the chart of the flow of the education, right? It goes from the primary education to the secondary education to the tertiary education. When I speak, if one of them is shaky, it has the probability of not developing into the tertiary level education in the first place, right? So we are going to use the fund solely to develop these children from when they're young, to make them improve themselves for the better. So for the sake of the future of the children, side with government.
Thank the government with for speech. Now invite opposition with whose representative case to be full.
Yeah.
What is the point of a strong base when there is nothing on the top? It was very simplistic for government to assume that there would be no wrong done in this debate, that tertiary education would be unscathed by their taking away of their funds, and that everybody would be happy-clappy at the end of the day. They should have just bitten the bullet. Because their safety net was that they only take away 50% from the unis. Sure, but they have to concede that there will be some effect, that either firstly these universities will have to downsize, or that they'll have to degrade in the quality, right? But considering that status quo is as bad as they say, and that primary and secondary education is horrible in status quo, will 50% even be enough, right? Because the idea is that primary and secondary education, it's so long, there's one in every single district. Although this isn't the main contention debate, but we have to understand that their safety net cannot stand, because there is there's no yardstick as to how much they will use, and therefore they are simply not being realistic. There are three questions we need to ask ourselves in this debate today. How do the developing nations get the progress that they need, firstly? Secondly, how do you affect students or potential students in these countries? And lastly, what are the repercussions on the nation and society as a whole? First question, how do we get progress? They tell us that we need to get progress by giving everyone the equal right to education. Sure, they do have an equal right to education because there is a school in almost every single district in the countries, right? We already analyzed to you, speaker by speaker, that the equality is there because they all have the same textbooks, they all have the same things that they can read and they can learn if they were to put value and hard work into their education, right? Their education here, secondary and primary, there is there for a base to tertiary, because but their best case scenario is that you have a nation of young people who get maybe 8 to 10 A's for their SPM, but they do not specialize in anything, right? Because it's only going to be the top majority, the top minority who can go into public universities, because most of these people who they're targeting are poor, right? So they need to go to public schools. So considering that a small minority are the only ones who will be able to specialize, and that the universities that they specialize in will also be degraded in quality, then you leave the vast majority of these people who you are trying to help stuck in this black hole where all of them only know basic ideas. This means that they are now only qualified to do things like waitress in McDonald's. Now there's nothing fine with, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that exactly, but like, first of all, you can't have a whole country full of people like that, and second of all, that's not the way for a developing nation to grow. You need to have people who specialize in things like engineering so that you can have more infrastructure, people who go further on so that they can teach in universities, teach in primary schools, and that's something that we want, right? But they told us also that tertiary education would still get funding, something that I talked to you about earlier on, because they say Toyota, Samsung are the ones who fund them, right? But we already told you that they only invest in mostly private institutions. But even if they did, companies invest when they see growth in the national universities, when they see growth, when they see potential. If these national universities are hurt, when you cut 50% or even more of their fundings, you make these universities of lower quality, and there's even less of a reason for these investors to invest in them. And this investment, when you take it away from these universities, is what's going to hurt the country even more, because it's the investments that went into places like the Manipal University in India that managed to raise up that country from just being a smaller developing country to furthering progress. We told you on our side what they really needed was to understand the principle of education. It's so that you can specialize, so that you can contribute to different areas of society. You can't do that when everybody only knows the same few basic things that don't necessarily get you very far in life. At the end of the day, they need education. And sure, while a good base is necessary, if there's nothing for them to go forward, not only will they not want to go forward, they just can't, and that's harmful for a developing nation. But second idea, right? How do you affect students? But sure.
Engage with the idea that literate society can better participate in democratization of the country. Your side never engaged with the idea.
Oh, okay, thank you. How is it that 17-year-olds with more SPM results are able to participate in democratization of society? I don't really understand that. But look, let's look at how exactly you affect them, right? Because basically what they told us is that now you can self-actualize because you tell them that they have education. They're all given that opportunity, right, to self-actualize. So why is it that they can't do that, right? The reason why a lot of them can't, have the skill to talk about read and things like that is because the families, these people themselves, the poor people, they don't see a value in this education for two reasons, right? Firstly, because they're only looking at short-term benefits, such as when they drop out, they can get petty little jobs, like helping their family, like fish or something like that. But the second idea is because, sometimes tertiary schools are simply inaccessible for them, because even in status quo, places like Mara, they can only accept so many people, right? And because a lot of these poor students, they simply don't see the value in these things because they have to wait so long to be able to get out of that school, that's when they don't take these jobs. It's even worse when you force universities to downsize or degrade in quality, because it's so much harder to get into them, especially now that they're more expensive, right? The motivation that these poor people really have to go into schools is when they see more opportunities, when they see a value in these schools. And you take away the value from these schools when you tell the universities that you are not worth my funding, I'm going to channel it to someone else who may not necessarily need it. Right? But they also try to tell us that the price wouldn't hike so much and therefore our harms were not there. But look, that's really simplistic, because money doesn't grow on trees, especially if you're talking about developing nations who have only a limited budget. If the universities go down by half, we have to accept that there will be a decrease in quality. But even if the price hike is not so much, even if it's not that drastic of a thing, it's still something, because poor kids are already disincentivized from going to school in status quo. You disincentivize them even more when you make it hard, right? And that's something that's really difficult. But now, second idea, last idea, repercussions on nation and society. Because they told us that basically the problem was a rich-poor gap, because only rich kids get to go to universities. And the way that state has been combating that in status quo is by having public universities trying to make them better. That's why places like Mara 20 years ago were not as good as they are now, and now they are producing outstanding members of society. The rich-poor gap is combated that way. But now when you condemn poor students to only go to public universities that were already not so good, but now even worse in their paradigm, you make it you decrease the skills that they themselves say the state needs, because the skills that the state needs that they try to talk about are specialized skills. While it helps to have more literate people, it's not enough because it does not increase their marketability by that much, right? It's worse than the skills taken from their university years. Firstly, less because less people can access it, but not as good because the state neglected that specialization. The best case scenario is that they have a nation of people with a bunch of secondary school education, but cannot specialize in anything, cannot move the country forward by that much. And that's not something that we're willing to stand for. Thank you.
Thank you, opposition. Speech by opposition. Excuse me, I'll take with speech by opposition. Good case for side opposition.
Gandhi once said that a grassroots of how a nation functions is based on the education system. That a nation can better flourish with the situation when the education system is complete, although it is not at its best situation. We argue to you the importance of completion, but more often than not, we argue to you a lot more things. In this situation, you remove the tertiary portion of the education system. At the end of the day, you remove the ability for people to take their passion, to take their diversity to an extent where they can specialize in their own careers, where they can contribute back to their country. And that's something that Bra explicitly talked about in this debate. Let's get this right, because at the end of the day, let's look at a few issues that came from their side, and how we necessarily dealt with it, and how we tackled the issues coming from their side. Firstly, how you talk about how you wanted to provide a better form of access in situations like this, and it's important to do so. We provided 3 responses, right? Firstly, we talked about how there is an exaggeration, that access is no longer that much of an issue. To a certain extent, even if it is an issue, the problem has severely reduced within situations like this. We're willing to bear the cost. Secondly, we talked about how it's not enough for you to cut off just 50% of a public funding university, where it's not necessarily a lot, to help public schools when you claim to say that a lot of schools require this problem to begin with. But when you concede to this, you won't take all. Right? We think that at the end of the day, sure, you won't take all the money at the end of the day. But we already told you from the get-go from my speech at the end of the day that a severe reduction in funding from a public university will severely harm the quality of education. Sure, it won't crumble and the education will go away, but we already told you that the quality of education is gone. To a certain extent, universities may or may not shut down. We don't want to bear that risk to begin with. But the third response we provided to you, you create a blank society that only prioritizes on one basic skill set that will never ever push the nation forward. Because what pushes a developing nation is diversity, is specialization. When you have the ability to have different doctors, different engineers that can help your country with a situation like this, we don't think it helps to begin with. We think, let's talk about how it better serves the interests of the state, because that's what they wanted to bring up in today's debate. We don't think it better serves the interest of the state, because the interest of the state is to have diversity in order to improve the situation. You only have a limited amount of skill sets. But let's talk about this, because it's only about democratization and how these individuals required to be part of the democracy and whatnot, so the situation. Evan already dealt with that in his speech. We don't think they heard. What did Evan tell you? He talked about how the education system is across the board the same. That means if you think that democracy is important, you want to teach people the right to vote, everyone will get that ability to learn how to vote with a situation like this. He talked about all this in his speech. We don't think they heard anything to begin with. But even if you think that they don't get something like this, we think democracy is less of a priority when it comes to the nation, where they have to forward their causes, when they have to become a developing nation. We provided responses to that. But let's talk about community and how these communities require a particular form of push at the end of the day. When you remove tertiary education, you do so. We don't think communities like this, especially below the poverty line, get any push at all, because the skill sets that you have will never get you out of the poverty line. You just learn how to read, you learn how to write, but you can never take that anywhere. You can never get a job, and you can never go and not become a farmer anymore to begin with. We think that's extremely harmful to do so. We think they're convenient responses that they had to our case, alright? Because if they told you that self-actualization is important, we question you. Where are you going to take your passion? Where are you going to take your career when tertiary education in your country is so bad? When private education is so expensive? I mean, public education becomes expensive, right? Because there is a hike in the price. Something we talked about that was not responded to begin with. What do we talk about? We talk about 4 things that were extremely ignored and dismissed throughout this debate. Number 1, talk about elements of education, how you require a particular form of completion in order for education to get some form of value within society. Number 2, we talk about how people will not want to go to school because there is no incentive to get a job, because you don't get a job at the end of the day. You don't get a proper job because education is not completed. Thirdly, we think that international recognition is important. Evan explicitly talk about that. When you want to get recognized by a lot of individuals, you get proper funding by a country. But fourthly, we talked about how you demoralize students as a whole. Now students have the ability to contribute back to the nation. We think these arguments were severely ignored by the whip, especially we think they false to begin with. But the contradiction that came from their side is very funny, because the Prime Minister told you that these individuals have bad access. But then the whip comes up and tells you that the situation is that, oh no, they have bad education system and we need the money for the education system. Then we told you 4 very important argumentations on why they need to do this, why they don't have to do this. We think extremely important. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, just because you have a free access to education doesn't mean that you have a fair, equal quality of education to begin with, right? I was disheartened by the response of the whip when I asked her what is on the idea that literate society could better participate in democratization of the society to begin with. This is a very important issue, right? Because we see that in developing nations, when the people doesn't necessarily understand what are their rights and what are their rights in the country, they cannot participate better in the process of political situation in society, and also that would further exacerbate the situation to begin with, because they would always resort to education to responses that will further exacerbate the political situation. But that's all. Let's take a look on the debate, right? They ask you, what's the use of a strong foundation when you have no tertiary education to go to? A misconception for the side of the government. We tell you that when you have, not only now under our paradigm, not only provide a strong basis for these people to begin with, but we still have access to tertiary education. We still fund the government universities. Just that we think that by limited capacity, these universities can better perform under our paradigm, right? But more importantly, we tell you that this is really important, because under our paradigm, we push them out of poverty line better, because people need to know that they have the power to education, that they can be empowered by education to go out of their poverty, and that is how you empower people from rural areas. That when they have a fair access to education, they have a fair, equal chances to everyone, regardless whether or not you're from urban or you're from rural. You still have the ability to fight for your future. And we also tell you that when we have good students, there are a lot of corporations who are willing to sponsor these students to begin with. So we don't see how this would further exacerbate, because their main constraint is that they don't have any tertiary education to go to. But we tell you that primary and secondary education is also important for you to have a better quality of tertiary education. So let's take a look at what we talk about on the government side, right? We talk about how this is really important, because literate society could further empower the society to participate not only in democratization of society, something that is really important for the developing nation. But Fatana also talked to you about how this could actually, this is for the benefit of the state interest. When you have a good investment in education, you provide the people with better skills, and these open an opportunity. And also how, in the long run, this will boost the economy. So by the end of the day, we will still have experts in various fields, right? We will still have doctors, we will still have lawyers. You've seen how Malaysia progressed when they don't even have much university to begin with. These people are still able to go to other universities overseas. They will still have the fair access to tertiary education for all you know. So your concern on where to go to your education is not valid at all. And in terms of quality, the government will surely, now that the capacity is limited, the government will more focus on focusing on the development of the university to begin with. So with that, go with the side of opposition government.
Thank you. Yeah. First of all, she has high employment perspective. Do my best as fast as possible.
Good job.
Good job.
Good job. Next.
Good job. Good job.
Good debate.
Sorry.
I say that.